The leak came through a forum I shouldn't have been reading during my lunch break at the Elephant Butte Power Relay Station, 40 miles north of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. A PDF, 14 pages, watermarked with a Department of Defense classification header that someone had tried to redact and failed. The epidemiological model was clean, precise, and projected a zoonotic neurotropic virus reaching critical mass in the southwestern United States within 7 to 10 days. The document was dated 6 days prior. I sat in my truck in the parking lot with a cold burrito in my lap and read it twice. The first time, I told myself it was fiction. The second time, I recognized the modeling software. I had used the same platform during my combat engineer deployment to estimate structural failure timelines in compromised bridges. Nobody writes fantasy in JMAE-7 format. Nobody fakes that. My name is Orrin Hasek. I'm 41 years old. I'm a licensed industrial electrician who spent 8 years in the Army Corps of Engineers before trading IEDs for insulator replacements on high-voltage transmission lines across southern New Mexico. I've lived alone since my divorce finalized 3 years ago. My ex-wife, Deborah, moved to Portland with our son, Caleb, who was 14 and already learning to forget my voice. I had a one-bedroom apartment in a town named after a game show, a truck with 200,000 miles on it, and a body that still remembered how to build things under pressure. That's what I had. That in 7 days, maybe less. I didn't call anyone. That's the part that still sits in the back of my throat when I swallow. I didn't call Deborah. I didn't call Caleb. I didn't post a warning. I didn't flag it to my supervisor, Russ, who was inside the relay station eating his own lunch and talking about the Lobos. I sat in the cab of my truck, finished the burrito, and started making a list. Not a survival list, a systems list. Fuel capacity, water access, structural defensibility, power generation. I was thinking like an engineer before I was thinking like a man. That order tells you something about me that I have never been comfortable knowing. The hydroelectric station at Caballo Dam was 17 miles south. I'd done contract work there twice once, replacing a corroded junction box on the penstock gate controls, once rewiring the emergency lighting in the lower turbine hall. The facility had been partially decommissioned 2 years earlier when the reservoir levels dropped below efficient generation thresholds during the drought. The turbines were still installed. The penstock was still functional. The dam itself was a concrete gravity structure. 200 feet of reinforced mass with a single access road on the east side and a steep basalt canyon wall on the west. The control building was poured concrete, built in the 1970s with Cold War grade resilience. I knew its wiring. I knew its bones. By the time I finished my shift that afternoon, I had a plan that fit on a napkin. 7 days. Secure the station, restore partial generation to at least one turbine, stockpile food, water purification, fuel, and medical supplies, fortify the access road. Do it alone. Tell no one. I drove home and packed everything I owned that mattered into 4 categories: tools, consumables, clothing, and weapons. The weapons category was short. A Mossberg 5.90 I kept for coyotes, a .357 revolver that had been my father's, and a roofing hatchet I'd carried since my first construction job at 19. I loaded the truck bed, covered it with a tarp, and drove to Walmart in T or C. It was 7:15 in the evening. The parking lot was normal. Families, shopping carts, a teenager on a skateboard. The world was still the world, and I was the man buying 9 cases of canned goods, 400 feet of paracord, 3 propane tanks, a water filtration pump, and every bag of rice on the shelf. The cashier, a woman named Dolores, whose name I only remember because it was printed on her tag in a font too large for the space, looked at my cart and said, "Stocking up for something?" I said, "Hurricane season." She said, "In New Mexico." I said, "You never know." That was the first lie. There would be others. Day one at Caballo was reconnaissance. I arrived before dawn, parked off the access road behind a juniper stand where the truck wouldn't be visible from the highway, and walked the perimeter on foot. The station was exactly as I remembered it. Brutalist concrete, partially overgrown with saltbush on the south face, the chain-link perimeter fence sagging but intact. The main gate had a padlock that took me 4 minutes with bolt cutters. Inside, the control building smelled like dust and mouse droppings, and the particular kind of dry silence that settles into places where electricity used to hum but doesn't anymore. I started with the turbine hall. 2 Francis-type turbines, horizontal shaft, each rated at 4 megawatts. Both were disconnected from the grid, but the mechanical assemblies were intact beneath their housings. The penstock intake was partially silted, but the gate valve responded when I manually cranked it stiff, resistant, then moving with the grudging compliance of machinery that hasn't been asked to work in too long. Water from the Caballo reservoir was still there, low but present. I calculated flow rate against turbine minimum. It would be tight. 1 turbine, maybe 60% capacity, if I could clear the intake screen and restore the excitation circuit. Enough to power the control building, the perimeter lighting. And this was the part that mattered, the electric fence I intended to build. The control room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the turbine hall through a plate glass observation window. The original panels were analog gauges, breakers, relay switches, the kind of equipment I understood because it predates the digital systems I was never trained to trust. The emergency generator, a diesel backup unit in a shed behind the main building, turned over on the 3rd attempt. It coughed black smoke, steadied, and held. I had diesel for maybe 40 hours of continuous run. That would bridge the gap while I restored the turbine. By noon, I'd inventoried the entire facility. 3 entry points. The main gate, a service door on the north wall, and the penstock access tunnel that ran from the intake structure down through the dam's interior to the turbine hall. The tunnel was the vulnerability. It was 4 feet wide, concrete-lined, and dark. Anything that got into the intake structure above could walk straight through it into the heart of the building. I spent the afternoon welding a steel grate across the tunnel mouth using a portable arc welder and angle iron I'd pulled from a collapsed storage rack in the maintenance bay. The sparks lit up the tunnel walls in orange bursts, and I worked with the kind of focus that only comes when the task in front of you is the only thing standing between you and a thought you're not ready to have. The thought was this: I might be insane. The PDF might be a hoax. I might be a divorced electrician having a very specific and very expensive nervous breakdown in an abandoned power station, welding gates against nothing while the world continued to shop at Walmart and argue about football. I held that thought the way you hold a live wire you can't yet drop on. Aware of it, vibrating with it, unable to let go or look directly at it. I ate cold beans from a can on the control room floor that night, my back against the console, the emergency generator humming through the walls. The lights worked. The perimeter fence was lit. The grate was welded. 1 day down, my phone still had signal. I checked the forum. The original PDF had been removed, but the thread had exploded 400 comments, half of them dismissive, half of them terrified. Someone had cross-referenced the virus model with livestock die-offs reported in Doña Ana County 2 weeks prior. Someone else had posted a video from a hospital in El Paso that was blurry shaky, and showed something moving in a way that human bodies do not move towards something that human bodies should run from. I watched it once. I set the phone face down on the concrete floor. I didn't sleep, not because I was afraid, but because my hands wouldn't stop calculating. Flow rates, weld strengths, caloric burn, days. The math was the only thing that didn't scream. Day 2. I began the turbine restoration. The excitation system on turbine 1 was dead. The voltage regulator had corroded beyond salvage. Its capacitors bloated and leaking a residue that smelled like burnt vinegar. I bypassed it entirely, wiring a self-excited configuration using components I stripped from turbine 2's intact regulator. It was inelegant. It was the kind of repair that would have gotten me written up in any proper facility. But proper facilities have supply chains and manufacturers and technicians who answer phones. And I had none of those things. I had wire, solder, a multimeter, and the memory of a field expedient generator repair I'd performed in Kandahar province when our FOB lost primary power during a sandstorm. That repair had worked for 11 days. I needed this one to work for longer. By afternoon, I had the penstock gate open to 30% and water moving through the turbine. The shaft turned. The generator coupled. I watched the voltmeter climb erratic, searching, then steadying at 237 volts, close enough to standard. I routed power through the main distribution panel, bypassing the grid connection entirely, and fed it to the control building's internal circuits. The overhead fluorescence in the turbine hall flickered and caught, filling the space with that flat industrial light that makes every surface honest. The hum of a working turbine is a specific sound and loud, but deep, a vibration you feel in the soles of your boots before your ears register it. I stood in that hum for a full minute, doing nothing. It was the first time in 2 days I felt something other than calculation. I spent the remaining daylight hours on the electric fence. The perimeter chain link was my skeleton. I ran hot wire along the top and bottom rails, spaced at 8-inch intervals, powered through a transformer I'd rigged to step down the turbine output to a pulsed, high-voltage, low-amperage deterrent. Enough to stun, enough to slow, not enough to kill, because I didn't know yet what it took to stop the things in that hospital video. And wasting amperage on assumptions is how engineers get people killed. Russ called me at 6 in the evening, my supervisor. I let it go to voicemail. He said he hadn't seen me at the relay station, asked if I was sick, told me to call back. His voice was normal, unhurried. The world hadn't ended yet for anyone but me and 400 strangers on a forum that was probably being monitored by the same people who'd failed to redact the watermark. I called Deborah instead. It was the first time I'd dialed her number in 7 months. She answered on the 4th ring, guarded, the way she always answered when my name appeared, like she was bracing for a request or an apology, neither of which she wanted. "Oren, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I just wanted to check on Caleb." "He's fine. He's at practice." A pause. "You don't call to check on Caleb." She was right. I didn't. That was the architecture of our failure. I had been a man who assumed that proximity was presence, that living in the same house meant I was raising my son. Deborah had corrected that assumption by removing both of them from the house. "If anything strange happens in the next week," I said, "anything on the news, anything that feels wrong, take Caleb and drive east, away from any city. Take water and food for 5 days." The silence on the line was longer than any sentence she could have spoken. "Oren, what are you talking about?" "Probably nothing. Just promise me you'll pay attention." "You're scaring me." "Good. I said, and I meant it. And I hated that I meant it. Scared is better than comfortable right now. She didn't promise. She asked if I was drinking again. I told her no. She said she had to go. The line went dead, and I held the phone against my forehead in the dark control room and listened to the turbine hum through the floor and wondered whether the cruelest thing I'd ever done to my family was leaving, or whether it was this knowing something and choosing to build a fortress for one instead of driving 1,500 miles to stand in front of them. Day 3, I reinforced the access road. The approach to Caballo Dam runs east from Highway 187 along a narrow, unpaved track that crosses a dry arroyo before climbing to the station's main gate. The arroyo was my first natural choke point, a 15-foot cut with soft sandbanks that would bog any vehicle not built for it. I drove my truck to a decommissioned BNSF rail siding 4 miles north, where I'd noticed stacked concrete rail ties during a contract job the previous year. I loaded 11 of them, each weighing close to 800 pounds, using a chain hoist rigged to my truck's brush guard. My shoulders screamed. My lower back sent telegrams of future consequence. I drove back and placed the ties across the arroyo crossing in a staggered pattern. Not a wall, but an obstacle that would force any approaching vehicle to slow, turn, and expose its flank. I was thinking about people. Not infected, people. That distinction mattered. The epidemiological model predicted societal collapse in concentric rings, healthcare failure first, then supply chain, then law enforcement, then civil order. The infected were the catalyst, but the danger I was engineering against on day 3 was the living. Desperate, mobile, armed, and convergent on any visible sign of power and safety. A lit building in a dark landscape is a lighthouse, and lighthouses attract everything, not just the ships you want to save. I built 2 observation posts from salvaged lumber and corrugated roofing, one on the bluff above the access road, one on the dam crest overlooking the reservoir approach. I cached water, a first aid kit, and ammunition at each. I ran hardwired communication between them and the control room, using telephone cable I'd pulled from the station's original internal system. No radios. Radios advertise. At midday, I drove into Truth or Consequences for the last time. The town felt ordinary, but the ordinary had a frequency I could detect now, a vibration beneath the surface, like the turbine hum, that told me things were moving underground. The gas station had a line. Not a long one, but a line. And lines at gas stations in small New Mexico towns on a Wednesday don't happen without reason. The hardware store owner, a man named Guzman, who'd sold me wire and fittings for years, was boarding his windows. "Storm coming?" I asked. He looked at me the way Dolores had not, with recognition, with the flat eyes of someone who'd seen the same document, or a cousin of it, or heard something from someone who had. "Family in Juarez says the hospitals are closed," he said. "Not full, closed. The army is outside and no one's going in." "When?" 3 days ago. I bought everything he'd sell me. PVC pipe, wire nuts, a roll of razor wire, 10 pounds of roofing nails, and a heavy-duty bolt gun designed for anchoring concrete. He didn't ask what I was building. He gave me a 10% discount he didn't explain, and I didn't question. I loaded the truck, and we stood in his parking lot in the 104-degree heat, and neither of us said the word that we were both building our separate architectures to survive. "You need help?" he asked. "No." "You sure?" "I work better alone." That was the second lie. I don't work better alone. I work alone because alone is the only configuration I haven't broken. I broke my marriage. I broke my relationship with my son. I broke every partnership that required me to trust someone else's competence as much as my own. The Army taught me to build. It also taught me that dependence on unreliable systems gets people killed. The problem was that I'd applied that lesson to humans, and humans aren't systems, and by the time Deborah explained that to me with a suitcase in each hand, the lesson had calcified into personality. I drove back to the station as the sun dropped behind the Caballo Mountains. The turbine was still running, the fence was still hot, the grate was still welded. In the distance, south toward El Paso, a column of smoke rose against the evening sky that was too large and too dark to be agricultural. I didn't drive toward it. I closed the gate and went to work. Day 4, the internet died. Not all at once, it degraded the way infrastructure does, in stutters and brownouts, pages half-loading, connections timing out. The forum threads I'd been monitoring freezing mid-refresh with timestamps that would never update. The last post I read was from a user in Las Cruces, 40 miles south, who wrote in the clipped syntax of someone typing fast. They're in Mesilla. Don't take I-10. Don't take any road south. If you can see the Organ Mountains, you're already too close. Then nothing. Cell service held longer. Texts went through when calls wouldn't. I sent Deborah one message. Watch the news. Go east if it gets bad. I love Caleb. I'm sorry I'm not better at saying it. She didn't reply. I don't know if it delivered. The gray check mark stayed gray, and then the screen went dark, and the phone became what it had always been without the network, a rectangle of glass and regret. I filled the silence with labor. Day 4 was water systems. The station had a municipal tap that was still flowing, but municipal pressure depends on pumping stations that depend on grid power, that depends on everything I'd watched degrade on the forum for 3 days. When that chain broke, the tap would go dry. I needed independence. The reservoir was right there, millions of acre-feet of impounded Rio Grande water sitting behind the dam I was living inside. The problem was filtration. Reservoir water carries sediment, agricultural runoff, and bacterial load that will shut down a human digestive system in 48 hours. I built a 3-stage gravity filtration system using 5-gallon buckets, sand and gravel I shoveled from the arroyo, and activated charcoal from a pet store filter I'd bought during my last Walmart run. The system was crude but functional. I tested the output with the iodine tablets in my first aid kit and got a clean result. 12 gallons per day, enough for 4 people. I'd built it for 4. I noticed that, as I tightened the last bucket connection, my hands had calculated for more than my mouth had admitted. Some part of my engineering brain had already accepted that I would not be alone here. Even as the rest of me was still welding gates and placing obstacles and telling hardware store owners I worked better solo. The radio I'd sworn off using, I turned on, not to transmit, to listen. I sat in the control room with a battery-powered AM/FM receiver and scanned the dial. Most stations were automated loops, pre-recorded music, syndicated programming running on servers that didn't need humans to press play. But Kobe, out of Las Cruces, was live. A woman's voice, calm in the way that training makes you calm when your hands are shaking, reading emergency management bulletins. All residents south of Interstate 25 are advised to shelter in place. Do not approach military checkpoints. Do not attempt to cross the Rio Grande south of Hatch. National Guard units have established a containment perimeter. Containment perimeter. The phrase sat in my stomach like a stone. Containment means they've drawn a line. It means everything south of that line is considered lost territory being managed, not rescued. And Caballo Dam was 12 miles south of Hatch. I was inside the perimeter, on the wrong side of the line drawn by the same government whose leaked document had brought me here. The broadcasts continued through the afternoon, growing more fragmented. The calm voice was replaced by a man who sounded less trained and more honest. He reported fires in Las Cruces. He reported that University Medical Center had been evacuated. He used the word overrun once, corrected himself to compromised, and then said nothing for 11 seconds of dead air before continuing. Those 11 seconds contained more information than anything he actually said. At sundown, the municipal water pressure dropped by half. By midnight, it was gone. The taps coughed air and rust and then silence. My filtration system was already running. The buckets dripped their slow, clean rhythm into the collection tank, and I listened to them the way you listen to a heartbeat, monitor each drop, a confirmation that the system I'd built was holding. The preparation had outrun collapse by exactly the margin I'd calculated. 12 gallons a day, for 4 people, that my hands had decided without asking me. Day 5. The first one came at dawn. I was on the dam crest checking the reservoir intake screen for debris when I saw a movement on the access road below. A figure. Walking from the east, from the direction of the highway, moving with the arrhythmic gait I'd studied in the El Paso hospital video but hadn't believed was real until it was 200 yards from my gate, in the cold blue light of a New Mexico morning. The body was male, middle-aged, wearing a button-down shirt torn open at the collar and khaki pants darkened with fluid I didn't want to identify from that distance. The walk was wrong in a way that no description prepares you for. It wasn't the stagger of injury or the shuffle of exhaustion. It was purposeful but uncoordinated, like a marionette operated by someone who understood direction but not anatomy. The legs moved. The head stayed fixed. The arms hung with a looseness that suggested the thing operating them had no interest in balance or self-preservation. It reached the arroyo and walked straight into the drop. Fell. Landed face first on the concrete rail ties. I watched through binoculars from 200 yards and saw it push itself upright, with arms that bent at angles I'd call compound fractures on any living person. It climbed over the ties without slowing, without looking for a path, without any of the route-finding behavior that distinguishes a conscious thing from a driven one. It walked to the gate. It pressed against the chain link. The electric pulse hit it, and the body seized, stumbled, pressed forward again. Seized again. Stumbled. Pressed. It didn't learn. That was the detail that separated theory from reality. An animal touches an electric fence once and doesn't touch it again. A human reads the warning sign and doesn't touch it at all. This thing touched it, suffered the consequence, and repeated the action with no behavioral modification. The voltage was enough to cause involuntary muscle contraction, which pulled the body away from the fence each time, creating a loop press, seize, fall back, press again. It continued this cycle for 40 minutes, while I watched from the dam crest, unable to look away, unable to reconcile what I was seeing with 20 years of understanding how living things respond to pain. I went down to the gate with the Mossberg. Standing 8 feet from the thing, I could see its face clearly. Eyes open but unfocused, not tracking me, not registering my presence as distinct from the fence or the concrete or the air. Its mouth opened and closed in a rhythm unconnected to breathing. There was no vocalization, no moan, no growl, none of the movie sounds I'd have expected. Just the wet mechanical movement of a jaw operating on a loop. And the smells sour, biological, the smell of a body whose chemistry had shifted from maintenance to consumption. I put a shell through its head from 4 feet, because that was what the forum's last surviving threads had recommended. And because standing there watching it press against my fence had begun to feel like cruelty rather than observation. The body dropped with a finality that was different from unconsciousness, an absolute cessation, like unplugging a machine. No twitching, no residual movement. Off. I buried it in the arroyo sand 50 yards from the gate, not out of respect, out of hygiene. And because the act of digging gave me something to do with the adrenaline that had nowhere to go once the trigger pull was over. By noon, there were 3 more on the access road. By evening, 7. All approaching from the east, from the highway, from the direction of whatever was left of truth or consequences. My electric fence held. The arroyo obstacles slowed them. I dispatched 5 from the observation post with the Mossberg and let the other 2 cycle against the fence until their bodies degraded enough that they stopped moving on their own. I cleaned the Mossberg in the control room that night and noticed my hands were steady. Not calm, steady. There's a difference. Calm is the absence of fear. Steady is the presence of training overriding the fear that is absolutely, structurally still there. 7 days. I'd used 5. The station held. I was no longer sure I would. Day 6 broke the architecture of solitude I'd spent the week constructing. Not the fence, not the grate, not the turbine, the idea that I could do this alone. That the fortress was complete because its builder was inside it. They arrived in a white Dodge minivan with a shattered rear window and New Mexico plates coated in dust and something darker. It came up the access road fast, bottomed out in the arroyo, lurched over the rail ties with the sound of metal scraping concrete, and stopped at my gate with the horn blaring in short, desperate bursts. I was in the observation post with the Mossberg across my knees, and I watched through the scope as the driver's door opened, and a woman fell out rather than stepped out, her legs not working right, or working on the last fumes of adrenaline that had kept them moving for however many miles she'd just driven. She was mid-30s, Latino, with a cut above her right eye that had bled down the side of her face and dried into a mask of rust. She stood using the door as a crutch and looked directly at the observation post, not at the gate, not at the building, at me. She could see me. She'd been looking for what a manned position looks like. That told me she had training or instinct. And at that moment, I wasn't sure which one I trusted more. "I have 2 children in this van," she said. Not shouting, projecting. The voice of someone accustomed to being heard in chaotic environments. "My son is 7. My daughter is 12. I have a bite on my left forearm that is not infected. It's from a dog in Williamsburg. I am a veterinarian. I can prove it. I have suture kits, antibiotics, and ketamine in a cooler in the back seat. Open this gate or tell me to leave, but do it now, because there are 9 of them walking this road, about 3 miles behind me." Her name was Marisol Inez Quintero. I didn't learn the full name until later, but I use it now because she earned every syllable of it in the days that followed. Her daughter, Luciana, was pressed against the inside of the passenger window, arms wrapped around a backpack, eyes tracking the perimeter with the particular scanning attention of a child who has recently learned that the world contains things that will not stop moving toward you. Her son, Tomas, was in the car seat behind his sister. He was asleep. How he was asleep was a question I didn't ask, and Marisol never answered. I had built the water system for 4. I opened the gate. She drove through. I closed it, reset the lock, and walked down from the observation post to meet her in the yard between the gate and the control building. Up close, the cut on her face was shallow forehead iliac. Lots of blood. No structural damage. Her left forearm was wrapped in gauze that was professionally applied, tight and clean. She held it up before I asked. "Dog bite, not human, not infected. You can examine it." "I'm an electrician, not a doctor." "Then trust me." I opened the wound, debrided it, and sutured it closed myself in a gas station bathroom in Hatch while my daughter held a flashlight. If it were infected, I'd be showing symptoms by now. The incubation window is under 90 minutes. I've been bitten since yesterday morning. I looked at the gauze, at her face, at the 12-year-old watching me from the van with eyes that were not asking for anything but were recording everything. Luciana was building a file on me in real time, cataloging whether I was a man who would help or a man who would close the gate. 3 miles behind you? Maybe less. They don't follow roads, but they follow noise, and this van isn't quiet. I had 47 shotgun shells remaining, and a revolver with 18 rounds. The electric fence had held against 7 over the previous day. 9 more would test the system differently, because 9 arriving in a cluster would mean simultaneous pressure on multiple fence sections. "Get the kids inside," I said. "Control building, 2nd floor. There's water in cans on the counter." Marisol didn't thank me. She moved. Gratitude is a luxury that comes later, if it comes at all, and she understood triage. The 9 arrived 40 minutes after Marisol's van. They came from the east in a loose spread. Not a group, there was no coordination, no pack behavior. Just 9 individual vectors drawn by the same stimulus converging on the same point. The first 3 hit the arroyo and tumbled over the rail ties. 2 more came from the south, having wandered off the road and across the open desert. 4 approached from the northeast, following the access road's trajectory but offset by 50 yards, walking through creosote and saltbush with the same indifference to terrain I'd observed in the first one. I was on the dam crest. Marisol was in the control room with the children. I'd given her the revolver with instructions I didn't need to explain. She'd handled it with a mechanical familiarity of a rural professional who euthanizes animals as part of her practice. Not a fighter, a practitioner. There's a distinction, and it mattered. The fence held for the first 6. The pulse cycling created the same press-seize retreat loop I'd observed before, and I picked off 3 from the observation post at distances between 60 and 100 yards. The Mossberg's effective range was compressing. I was spending 2 shells per target instead of 1, and the math of 47 shells minus 3 per target against an unknown population was a calculation I kept running in the background like a process I couldn't close. Then the 7th one found the service door. I hadn't reinforced the service door. It was on the north wall, a steel fire door with a crash bar, and I'd locked it from the inside with a deadbolt and a 2x4 wedged under the handle. Standard barricade. The kind of thing that works against people, because people push and then reassess, and then push harder, and then look for another way. This thing pushed, and pushed, and pushed. The rhythmic impacts were audible from the dam crest, a metronomic banging that had no frustration in it, no escalation, just force applied, without variation or doubt. I came down from the crest and circled the building to the north face. It was a woman, or had been wearing hospital scrubs in one shoe, her hair matted with dried fluids, both hands flat against the door, pushing with her entire body weight, in a cycle timed to some internal clock I couldn't identify. The deadbolt was holding, but the 2x4 was shifting with each impact, the bottom edge sliding millimeters across the concrete floor. I killed it with the Mossberg from 15 feet, and the sound of the shot in the narrow gap between the building and the canyon wall was a physical assault on my eardrums that left a ringing which lasted 3 hours. When I came back inside, Marisol was standing at the top of the stairs, with the revolver pointed at the door I'd just opened. Behind her, Luciana was sitting with Tomas in her lap on the control room floor. The boy was still asleep. "The north door needs reinforcement," I said. I noticed. She lowered the revolver. What do you have for welding? Arc welder, angle iron. Why? Because I spent 2 summers working construction with my uncle in Deming before vet school. And because you can't weld and watch the perimeter at the same time. I stared at her. She stared back with the patience of someone who has spent her professional life waiting for frightened animals to stop panicking and accept help. Can you run a bead? I can run a bead, I can cut pipe, and I can do both while you're on the roof keeping those things off the fence. Or you can do it alone and sleep 2 hours a night until you make a mistake that kills all of us. Your choice, but make it now. I handed her the welding helmet. She put it on, adjusted the headband with one hand, and went downstairs. Within 20 minutes, the banging sound had been replaced by the crackling hiss of a welding arc. And the north door was gaining a steel reinforcement plate that was uglier and stronger than anything I would have built myself. I stood on the dam crest in the dark and watched the desert for movement and thought about the word us. It had been a long time since that word had included me. Day 7. The day the outbreak was supposed to begin according to the model, except the model had been wrong not about the event, but about the timeline. The outbreak had started at least 2 days early, which meant the predictive framework I'd staked my preparation on had an error margin wide enough to drive every assumption I'd made through and off a cliff. The morning was quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if the desert itself was pausing between contractions. Marisol had slept in 3-hour shifts, alternating with me on the observation post, a schedule she'd proposed and I'd accepted because she was right that I couldn't sustain 20-hour days without cognitive degradation. She'd used that phrase, cognitive degradation, and I'd recognized in her the same engineering mindset I carried, just applied to biological systems instead of electrical ones, over coffee brewed on a propane burner in the control room. She told me her story in the compressed shorthand of someone who has already decided which details matter and which are weight she can't afford to carry. She'd been at her clinic in Las Cruces when the first cases hit University Medical Center. A colleague in the ER had called her not for help, but to say goodbye. She'd loaded the kids, grabbed her veterinary supplies, and driven north. Her husband, Raphael, had been at work at White Sands Missile Range. The base had locked down. No outgoing calls, no departures. She didn't know if he was alive. She said this while pouring powdered creamer into her coffee with steady hands. And I understood that the steadiness was the same as mine, not calm, just trained. "You built all of this in 5 days?" she asked, looking at the turbine readout on the console. 6. I wasted day 1 on reconnaissance I could have done in 3 hours. It's impressive. It's incomplete. Everything's incomplete. That's not a flaw, that's the condition. She set down her coffee. "What's your plan if the reservoir drops below turbine intake level?" I didn't have one. The drought had been lowering the reservoir for years, and the current level was 11 feet above minimum generation threshold. If it dropped through evaporation, downstream release, or structural compromise, the turbine would lose water and the station would go dark. How long at current levels? Months, probably. But I don't have data on the upstream flow. If the dams above us Elephant Butte, if their operations stop, the inflow stops, and the reservoir level becomes a countdown. She nodded. So we need a backup power source. Solar would work. Panels, charge controllers, battery bank. Everything I'd need is at the hardware stores in T or C, which are inside infected territory now. Yes. We sat with that. The turbine hummed below us. Tomas was eating canned peaches at the desk in the corner, kicking his legs against the chair in a rhythm that Luciana was trying to stop with increasingly elaborate hand signals. The girl hadn't spoken to me yet. She spoke to her mother in rapid Spanish that I understood about 60% of, and she spoke to Thomas in English with the exasperated authority of a sibling who has aged 5 years in a week. She did not speak to me, and I didn't push it, because I recognized in her silence the same assessment I'd made about Guzman in the hardware store she was watching to see if my actions matched my architecture before she invested any words. "There's something else," Marisol said. "The ketamine. What about it?" Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic. In veterinary practice, it's used for sedation and pain management. In a human survival context, it's the closest thing to a surgical anesthetic we're going to find. I have 14 vials. That's enough for maybe 6 major procedures. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to know what we have. And I need you to know that my skills aren't limited to welding. If someone gets hurt, cut, broken, bitten by something that isn't infected, I can operate. I've opened abdomens and set compound fractures. The patients were dogs and horses, but the anatomy translates more than you'd think. A veterinarian and an electrician. It wasn't a survival team anyone would design, but it was the one standing in a functioning hydroelectric station while the world outside went dark, and that counted for something. They came on the morning of day 8, not infected. Not yet. Yeah. Just desperate in the way that makes desperate indistinguishable from dangerous until you've already made a decision you can't take back. 2 men and a woman on foot, walking up the access road in full daylight, hands raised, carrying nothing visible except the weight of however far they'd walked to get here. They stopped at the arroyo when they saw the rail ties. One of the men tall, sunburned, wearing a sweat-soaked polo shirt that had probably been presentable 3 days ago, cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "We can see your lights. We know someone's in there. We have no weapons. We need water." I was in the observation post. Marisol was beside me with the binoculars. Below us, inside the control building, Luciana was watching Tomas, and the turbine was turning, and the fence was hot, and everything I had built in 7 days was about to be tested by a question that no amount of engineering could answer. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think they're telling the truth." Marisol lowered the binoculars. "The woman is favoring her right leg. The shorter man has been carrying her. You can see the wear pattern on his shoulder where her arm's been. That doesn't mean they're safe." "No, it means they're human, which is the thing you've been engineering against since day 3. She wasn't wrong. And the precision of the observation was surgical. She'd watched me build the arroyo obstacles, the observation posts, the electric fence, and she'd understood that the defensive logic was pointed as much at the living as the dead. I'd designed this place to be impregnable. And impregnable doesn't have a door you open because someone asks nicely. "We have water for 4, I said. "You built it for 4. There are currently 3.5 of us, counting Thomas as half a ration. 3 more brings us to 6.5. Your filtration system can be scaled. You know it can." "Scaling takes materials I'd need to go get." "Then go get them." "From where? T or C is..." "I know where T or C is. I drove through what's left of it." She paused. "Oren, you built this place to survive. But there's a difference between surviving and hoarding, and the line between them is thinner than you want it to be." The 3 strangers were still standing at the arroyo, hands raised, the tall man's voice carrying in the dry air as he repeated his plea. Behind them, the access road was empty. No infected visible. The morning was clear and hot, and the desert stretched in every direction with the merciless indifference it has always had toward every human drama played out on its surface. I thought about the model, the PDF, the 14 pages that had started all of this. The model predicted social collapse in concentric rings. And one of its variables, the one I'd skimmed past because it was uncomfortable, was what it called resource hoarding isolate behavior. The model predicted that isolated survivors with resources would become targets, and that the survivors most likely to become targets were the ones who refused to build alliances. Fortresses without communities become tombs, the model said that. Page 11, paragraph 3. I'd read it and built the fortress anyway, because building is what I do, and community is what I've failed at for the entire duration of my adult life. Marisol didn't say anything else. She'd made her argument, and she was done, because she was a woman who understood that persuasion past a certain point becomes coercion, and she wasn't interested in coercing me. She was interested in being right and letting me arrive at the conclusion on my own schedule. I climbed down from the observation post, walked to the gate, and opened it. "Come through the arroyo," I called. "Stay on the road. Don't touch the fence." The tall man, his name was Garrett Lowell, 44, former high school science teacher from Hatch, lowered his hands and exhaled a sound that wasn't a word, but contained every word he'd been holding. They crossed the arroyo, and I closed the gate behind them, and wondered if I'd just built something or broken something. Marisol, watching from the post above, didn't say I told you so. She didn't need to. Garrett's companions were his wife, Nina, the one with the injured leg, a badly sprained ankle wrapped in a torn bedsheet, and a 26-year-old man named Devonte Harris, who'd been a tire technician at a Les Schwab in Hatch and had joined the Lowells when their truck died and his shop became untenable. Devonte was quiet, not shy processed. He'd seen things between Hatch and Caballo that had compressed his effect into a narrow band where words came out flat and functional, stripped of emotional decoration. I gave them water first, then canned food, then the ground rules. Marisol had suggested the ground rules, and I'd agreed because structure prevents the kind of ambiguity that breeds conflict. Rule 1, everyone works, no passengers. If you eat from the supply, you contribute to the supply or the defense or the maintenance. Rule 2, the turbine room is restricted. The generation system is the heart of the station. One accidental contact with the wrong terminal and the whole facility goes dark. Only Marisol and I entered the turbine room. Rule 3, water is metered. 12 gallons per day at current filtration capacity. I'd expand it, but until then, rationing was non-negotiable. Rule 4, no one opens the gate without consensus. Not majority vote. Consensus. Every adult agrees, or the gate stays closed. Garrett listened to all 4 rules with the attentive posture of a man accustomed to being in classrooms. Then asked the only question that mattered. What happens when someone disagrees on Rule 4? Then we talk until someone changes their mind. And if nobody changes their mind, then the gate stays closed. Default is closed. He chewed on that. Nina, sitting with her ankle elevated on a supply crate, watched the exchange with the tired eyes of someone who'd already learned that arguing with men about doors was less productive than simply being ready when the door opened or didn't. Devonte said nothing. He finished his can of beans, washed the can in a bucket, and asked where the tools were. I pointed him toward the maintenance bay. Within an hour, he had organized my chaotic hardware stockpile into categorized rows on the shelving units, sorted by function and size, with a precision that bordered on compulsive and was exactly what I'd been too focused on big systems to do for the small ones. I used to inventory the shop, he said when he noticed me watching. Tires, rims, hardware, 400 SKS, everyone in its place. You're on supply management. That's what I figured. Garrett's contribution emerged the same afternoon. He found the station's original operations manual in a filing cabinet. I hadn't opened a 300-page binder documenting every system, every maintenance schedule, every failure mode the original engineers had anticipated. He read it like a textbook, marking pages with torn paper strips. And by evening, he'd identified a secondary water intake I hadn't known about, a manual siphon designed for fire suppression that drew from a separate reservoir pool behind the dam's spillway. It doubled our available water source. "You didn't know about this?" he asked, holding the binder open to a schematic I'd never seen. "I did electrical work here, not civil." "Fair enough. But this means your 4-person water limit is actually 8 if we build a second filtration unit." I looked at the schematic. He was right. The siphon intake was accessible from the maintenance bay through a tunnel I'd assumed was sealed. The water quality would be rougher spillway pool, collected more sediment than the main reservoir, but filtration could handle it. 3 strangers had been inside my fortress for 6 hours, and had already expanded its capacity beyond what I'd built alone in a week. The math was obvious and uncomfortable. I was a better engineer than I was a planner. And planning requires the kind of distributed intelligence that only comes from multiple minds working the same problem from different angles. Marisol found me on the dam crest that evening, staring at the smoke columns, now visible in 3 directions, south, east, and for the first time, north. "You're angry," she said. "I'm not angry. You're angry that they're useful, because it means you were wrong to want to be alone." I didn't answer, which was its own answer, and she knew it. The first real breach came on day 9, and it came from the direction I'd flagged as a vulnerability on day 1, the penstock tunnel. I was running the morning inspection of the turbine hall when I heard it, a scraping sound from behind the steel grate I'd welded across the tunnel mouth. Rhythmic, persistent. The sound of something dragging itself along the concrete tunnel, lining toward the only barrier between the reservoir intake and the interior of the station. I killed the overhead lights. In the sudden dark, I could see the grate at the tunnel entrance illuminated by the faint gray light filtering down from the intake structure above. Something was there. A shape, pressed against the grate. One arm reaching through the gaps between the angle iron bars, fingers opening and closing on empty air. The grate held. My welds held. But the thing on the other side wasn't alone. Behind it, in the tunnel's depth, I could hear others. 2, maybe 3. The sounds overlapping, scraping, shuffling, the wet friction of bodies moving through a space too narrow for them to move efficiently. They'd entered the reservoir. Walked in, most likely, from the upstream bank where the water was shallow enough to wade. Found the intake structure. Fallen or walked through the intake screen, which I'd cleaned but not reinforced, and followed the tunnel downhill toward the sound of the turbine, because the turbine vibration transmitted through the concrete and the water and the ground like a beacon for anything that navigated by stimulus rather than intention. My turbine. My beautiful, humming, life-sustaining turbine was calling them. I ran upstairs and found Marisol already awake. She'd heard my boots on the stairs and met me with the revolver out. Penstock tunnel, at least 3 at the grate. Will it hold? The welds will hold. The angle iron will hold. But the intake screen won't. If more of them find the reservoir and walk in, the screen will clog or collapse, and we'll lose water flow to the turbine. How long? Depends on how many. If the screen clogs with bodies, hours. If it collapses, the debris could foul the penstock gate. Then we lose generation. She processed this the way I'd watched her process everything quickly, without panic, mapping the problem against available solutions. Can you reinforce the intake screen from inside the tunnel? Not with them in it. Then we clear the tunnel. We woke Garrett and Devante. I explained the situation in the compressed terminology of an operational briefing: threat description, location, risk to systems, proposed action. Garrett's face went pale, but his hands stayed still. Devante picked up the roofing hatchet from the tool wall without being told and tested its weight with a grip that said he'd swung something heavy for a living. The plan was crude because the space demanded it. The tunnel was 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, no room for firearms without risking ricochet off the concrete walls. Melee only. Single file. I went first with a 3-foot length of steel pipe. Devante behind me with a hatchet. Garrett at the rear with a pry bar and a flashlight. Marisol stayed in the control room with the children and the revolver and the instruction. If we don't come back in 20 minutes, close the turbine room door and seal it. The tunnel was cold. The walls were wet. The sound of our breathing filled the space with a humidity that tasted like iron and fear. I could see the grate ahead, 15 yards in, and the shapes pressed against it, 3 of them, as I'd estimated. Their bodies wedged into the narrow space, arms reaching, jaws working. I hit the first one through the grate bars with the steel pipe. The skull gave with a sound I will not describe because language is insufficient and because some sounds deserve to be forgotten rather than preserved. Devante reached through with the hatchet for the second. Garrett held the light steady with hands that shook but didn't waver. 3 down. The tunnel beyond the grate was clear, but the intake screen, visible in the flashlight's beam through 40 yards of concrete passage, was bowing inward. Something was pressing against it from the reservoir side. Something heavy, something plural. I reinforced the intake screen from inside the tunnel by crawling past the grate, which Devante unbolted from the maintenance side, while I held position and working my way to the intake structure in wet darkness, with a bag of tools and a headlamp that turned every water droplet into a floating point of light. The screen was a heavy-gauge steel mesh bolted to a concrete frame, and whatever had been pressing against it from the reservoir side had buckled 2 of the attachment points. I could see through the mesh into the murky green of the reservoir. And in that green, shapes moved slow, drifting, not swimming, but walking along the bottom in the silt-reduced visibility, bumping against the structure with the aimless persistence that characterized everything about them. I counted 6 before I stopped counting. The repair took 90 minutes. I replaced the buckled bolts with threaded rod driven through drilled holes in the concrete frame, backed with steel plates from my dwindling supply of angle iron. The mesh held. But the mesh was never designed to be a barrier. It was designed to keep debris out of a turbine, not to resist the continuous mechanical pressure of bodies that don't tire and don't quit. When I crawled back through the tunnel, Devante was waiting at the grate with the hatchet and a look on his face that I recognized from my own mirror, the expression of a man who has accepted a reality he would prefer to negotiate with, but cannot. "How many?" he asked. "At least 6 in the water. Could be more upstream." So the reservoir is compromised. The reservoir is a body of water connected to the Rio Grande, which is connected to every population center between here and Albuquerque. It was always going to be compromised. I just thought we'd have more time. Garrett was waiting in the turbine hall with the operations manual open to the fire suppression siphon schematic. If the intake clogs, we switch to the secondary source. The spillway pool is isolated from the main reservoir by the dam structure itself. Nothing in the river can reach it unless it climbs over the spillway, which is a 30-foot vertical concrete face. That only helps with water supply. If the intake clogs, the turbine loses flow. Then we go to the diesel backup. 40 hours of fuel. The silence that followed was the silence of people doing the same math and arriving at the same number and wishing the number were different. Marisol broke it. We need more fuel, or we need solar, or we need to reduce the intake vulnerability. Pick one and commit. I picked two. I committed to a scavenging run for solar panels and diesel, and I committed to building a secondary screen inside the tunnel that would serve as a backup if the primary intake screen failed. The secondary screen would be closer to the grate, in a section of tunnel I could access and maintain without crawling into a space occupied by underwater dead. The scavenging run was the problem. Truth or Consequences was 11 miles north, and every mile between here and there was open desert or highway with no cover and unknown infected density. The hardware store Guzman's store would have what I needed if it hadn't been looted. The gas station would have diesel if the tanks hadn't been drained. I'll go with you, Devante said. You don't have to. Man, don't do that. Don't give me the choice like it's optional. You need someone watching while you load. I'm the one without a family here. I'm the one who costs the least if it goes wrong. The bluntness of his arithmetic stopped me. He wasn't being brave. He was being actuarial. And the actuarial logic of a childless 26-year-old volunteering over a father of two or a mother of two was sound in a way that made my stomach turn, because soundness and decency were pulling in different directions, and the gap between them was a space I didn't want to stand in. We leave at 4 a.m, I said. Back before full light. Devante nodded. He went to the maintenance bay and began sharpening the hatchet on a whetstone with the focused attention of a man preparing for something he intends to return from. We took my truck with the headlights off, navigating by moonlight and memory. The desert at 3:30 in the morning is a monochrome landscape where distance becomes unreliable, and every creosote bush is a silhouette that might move. Devante rode shotgun with the hatchet across his lap and the Mossberg between his knees. And we drove in silence, because silence was operationally necessary, and because neither of us had words adequate to the task of driving toward a town we both knew might be a graveyard. Highway 187 was empty. No vehicles, no movement, no headlights in either direction. The absence of traffic on a highway that normally carried at least a trickle of pre-dawn truckers was its own kind of information. In a negative space where normalcy used to be, its shape defined by everything that was missing. We reached the outskirts of T or C in 14 minutes. The town was dark. Not partially lit, not flickering dark. Every street light out. Every storefront black. The only illumination was the moon and the faint glow of something burning slowly in the residential blocks east of Main Street. A structure fire that had consumed most of its fuel and was settling into embers. Guzman's hardware store was intact. The windows were unbroken, the door was locked, and the closed sign hung straight in the glass. I picked the lock, a skill I'd learned not from criminal enterprise, but from 18 years of opening electrical panels in buildings where the maintenance staff had lost the keys. Devante watched the street while I worked. His head on a swivel, the Mossberg held with a readiness that told me he'd done something in his past that he hadn't mentioned. Inside, the store smelled like dust and oil and normalcy. The shelves were full. Nobody had looted Guzman's store because Guzman had boarded the windows and locked the door and left. And because looters go to grocery stores and gun shops, not hardware stores. The apocalypse had not yet taught people that hardware is more valuable than food, because food sustains a body for a day, and hardware sustains a system for a year. I found 4 solar panels, 300-watt monocrystalline units Guzman had stocked for the off-grid rancher market. 2 charge controllers, a battery bank that would need to be wired in series, cable, connectors, mounting hardware. I loaded it all into the truck bed with the controlled urgency of a man shopping in a store that might become a trap. Devante found the diesel. Not at the gas station. The station's pumps were electric and the power was out. He found it at the BNSF rail yard, 2 blocks south, where a switching locomotive sat on a siding with a 200-gallon fuel tank that was 3/4 full. He siphoned it into every container we had, 5-gallon jerry cans, the 2 50-gallon drums I'd brought, even a cleaned-out water cooler jug that would need to be labeled and segregated. 140 gallons. At the diesel backup generator's consumption rate, that was roughly 280 hours of continuous power. Nearly 12 days. We were loading the last drum when Devante froze. His hand went to my arm and squeezed not a signal I'd taught him, just the primate reflex of a human who has seen something, and it needs another human to see it too. Down the rail yard, at the far end of the switching tracks, a group was moving. Not the aimless individual wandering I'd seen at the station. A group, 20, maybe 30, walking in the same direction with a rough alignment that suggested they were following something, a sound, a smell, some stimulus I couldn't identify from 300 yards in the dark. They were moving north, away from us, toward the residential blocks, toward whatever was left of the people who hadn't left town. "We go," I whispered. "We go," Devante agreed. We drove back to Caballo with the headlights off and the diesel sloshing in the drums, and the silence between us filled with the image of 30 shapes moving together. And what that meant for the model's prediction about the progression speed. The model had been wrong about the timeline. It might also be wrong about the ceiling. I installed the solar array on the control building's flat roof on day 10, while Marisol and Garrett expanded the water filtration to a second unit fed by the spillway siphon. The panels went up cleanly, mounting brackets bolted to the parapet. Cable runs through a conduit I drilled into the roof membrane. Charge controllers wired to the battery bank I'd staged in the control room. By noon, the system was producing and storing. Not enough to run the whole station. The turbine's output dwarfed solar, but enough to maintain lighting, the electric fence, and the water pumps if the turbine went down. A backup for the backup. Redundancy is the only theology an engineer trusts. Devante was on the observation post when the radio signal came. Not the AM broadcast I'd been monitoring that had gone silent 2 days prior. The Kobe announcer's last transmission, a truncated sentence about National Guard withdrawal that ended in a carrier tone and nothing else. This was shortwave, a frequency I'd found while scanning, a voice I didn't recognize, male, with the cadence of someone reading from prepared notes. "This is Sierra Lima 19er broadcasting from Kirtland Air Force Base to any surviving stations south of the Albuquerque perimeter. Federal Coordination Authority has been transferred to FEMA Region 6 under executive order. All civilian infrastructure with operational power generation is requested to identify and report on frequency 147.55 MHz. Repeat, all civilian infrastructure with operational power generation." He said it 3 times. I listened to all 3 iterations, writing down the details on the back of a turbine maintenance log. Then I turned the radio off and sat in the control room, staring at the wall. They wanted us to identify ourselves, to broadcast our location, our capability, our existence, to put a pin on a map that somebody in a military operations center would add to a database of assets. And assets, in military terminology, are things that get used. Garrett found me 20 minutes later. He'd been listening on the maintenance bay's portable unit. "We should respond." "No. Oren, they're establishing a network. Surviving infrastructure. If there's a coordinated recovery effort..." "There's no recovery effort. There's inventory. They want to know what's still running so they can decide what to requisition, redirect, or strip. That's speculation. That's experience. 8 years in the Army taught me what happens to useful things in a command structure that's lost control. They get consumed. A working hydroelectric station with a defensible position and a functioning power grid becomes a forward operating base, and the civilians inside it become either conscripted labor or relocated surplus. He looked at me with the eyes of a man who still believed in institutions. Not naively, Garrett was too intelligent for naivety, but with the residual faith of someone whose life had been spent inside systems that functioned. Schools, districts, hierarchies that produced outcomes. He hadn't yet metabolized the reality that those systems had collapsed, not because they were attacked, but because they were never designed to absorb this kind of stress. "And if they're offering evacuation?" he asked. "To where?" "Every city in the state is either dark or burning. Kirtland is a military base. If they're still operational, it's because they've got fences and firepower and a closed perimeter. They're not opening that perimeter for 6 civilians. They're asking us to report so they can update a spreadsheet." "You don't know that." "No, I don't. And that uncertainty is exactly why I'm not broadcasting our position." We brought it to the group that evening. Rule 4. No one opens the gate without consensus. I argued that broadcasting was the equivalent of opening the gate. It told the world where we were and what we had. Garrett argued that isolation was a death sentence running on a longer clock. Nina, her ankle healing, said nothing but held Garrett's hand in a way that communicated her vote without requiring a word. Devante looked at the floor and said, "I don't trust anything that comes through a speaker anymore." Marisol was the tiebreaker. She looked at me. She looked at Garrett. She said, "We listen, we don't transmit. For now." The radio stayed on receive. The gate stayed closed. Consensus held by a margin of 1. Day 12. The infected found the access road in numbers, not the 1s and 2s I'd been managing since day 5. This was the trailing edge of the mass we'd seen in T or C, or a new group entirely, drawn south by some migratory logic I couldn't map. 40 or more, emerging from the desert east of the highway in the early morning light, walking toward the station with the collective momentum of a crowd that has no mind, and therefore no doubt. I was on the dam crest. Devante was in the eastern observation post. Marisol was in the control room monitoring the turbine. Garrett and Nina were reinforcing the secondary water filtration in the maintenance bay. Luciana was watching Tomas in the upstairs corridor, and from my position, I could see her pressed against the window, looking at the same thing I was looking at the access road, filling with shapes that moved like a slow flood, inexorable and mindless. The arroyo slowed them. The rail ties broke their formation, such as it was, into individuals who stumbled and climbed and fell again. The electric fence stopped the first wave of 8 or 10 hitting the chain link simultaneously, the pulse cycling through bodies that seized and fell back and pressed forward again. But 8 simultaneously was different from 1 at a time. The load on the fence circuit spiked, and the transformer I'd rigged began to heat. I could see the junction box on the south fence post beginning to smoke. "Devante, fence transformer overheating. I need you to cut power to section 3 and reroute to sections 1 and 2. His voice came back through the hardwired phone, steady. "On it." The fence went dark on the south section. The infected that had been cycling against it stopped seizing and began pushing with uninterrupted force. Chain link is strong in tension but weak against sustained lateral pressure, and I watched the posts begin to lean. I came down from the dam crest at a run, Mossberg loaded, pockets stuffed with shells. I reached the south fence as the first post failed, the concrete footing cracking, the post folding inward, the chain link sagging to create a gap that was not yet passable but would be in minutes. I fired into the cluster. The Mossberg spread at that range was wide enough to affect multiple targets, but affect and stop are different words with different consequences, and I learned the difference in 11 seconds of sustained fire. Buckshot to the torso staggered them. Buckshot to the head dropped them. I dropped 6 in 8 shots, and the remaining cluster, maybe 20, pressed through the gap over the bodies of the fallen like water finding the crack in a dam. Devante arrived at my flank with a hatchet and a length of rebar he'd grabbed from the maintenance bay. We held the gap for 9 minutes that felt like something time doesn't measure. I fired and reloaded and fired. He swung and retreated and swung, the gap filled with bodies, some dead, some still moving, the pile itself becoming a barrier that the ones behind had to climb. Garrett appeared with the pry bar and a fury I hadn't expected from a science teacher. He anchored the left side of the gap while I held the right, and between the 3 of us, we held the breach until the last of the group was down, or had wandered past the gap toward the canyon wall, where the basalt cliff face offered no entry and no stimulus to hold their attention. 37. We counted afterward, walking the perimeter, marking each body with spray paint to avoid double counting. 37 that had reached the fence. An unknown number still in the desert. I'd used 31 shotgun shells. I had 16 remaining. The south fence was destroyed across a 40-foot section. The transformer was burned. The junction box was melted slag. 3 days of electrical work undone in 9 minutes. I sat on the ground with my back against the dam wall and my hands on my knees and stared at the gap in my perimeter and thought, this is what I built. This is what it cost. And this is what it costs to rebuild. Then I stood up and started rebuilding. Rebuilding the south fence took 2 days and required every remaining foot of chain link, wire, and angle iron in our inventory. I redesigned the section with double posts, each anchor point now. A paired assembly with cross-bracing that distributed lateral force across a wider foundation. Devante dug new post holes in the hardpan, while Garrett mixed concrete from bags we'd stockpiled. And Marisol rewired the fence circuit with a redesigned transformer setup that used 2 smaller units in parallel instead of 1 large one, so that a single-point failure couldn't kill an entire section. She'd learned the electrical configuration by watching me, not by asking, by watching, and then practicing on a bench setup in the maintenance bay, and then presenting me with a completed wiring diagram that was better than mine because she'd included a fuse stage I'd overlooked. Where did you learn to read electrical schematics? Large animal diagnostic equipment, MRI machines, ultrasound units, digital X-ray systems. Half of veterinary medicine is keeping your imaging equipment running because the manufacturer's service contract costs more than your annual revenue. So, you're an electrician. I'm a veterinarian who can't afford to not be an electrician. There's a difference. There was a difference. But the output was the same competence applied under pressure, with the humility to learn what you don't know and the confidence to use what you do. I'd spent my whole life believing that competence was solitary, that the best work came from one mind with one plan executed without committee. Marisol's existence was a refutation of that belief so thorough that I couldn't argue with it, only sit with it and let it reshape something I'd carried since Kandahar. Luciana spoke to me for the first time on the evening of day 13. I was on the dam crest, checking the reservoir level. It had dropped 8 inches since my arrival, a rate consistent with evaporation and minimal inflow, when she appeared at the top of the access stairs and stood 3 feet away, looking at the water. My mom says you built the electricity. I restored it, The dam builders made the electricity. I just reconnected it. She considered this with the seriousness of a 12-year-old who has learned to weigh words. She says you were going to stay here alone. That was the plan. That's a stupid plan. I looked at her. She looked at me. There was no cruelty in her face, just the clarity of a child who has not yet learned to soften truth for the comfort of adults. You're right, I said. It was a stupid plan. She nodded, satisfied, and went back downstairs. That exchange 11 seconds. 32 words rearranged more inside me than the 41 years that preceded it. Because Luciana wasn't being kind or diplomatic or strategic. She was stating a fact that every person in the station already knew, and that I had been too fortified in my own architecture to admit. Day 14. 2 weeks since the PDF. The world outside the station had resolved into a landscape I could read from the dam crest like a topographic map of collapse. Smoke in 3 quadrants. No lights anywhere on the visible horizon. The shortwave radio continued to broadcast from Kirtland. The same message, the same request for infrastructure identification, now with an addendum. Surviving civilian groups are advised to consolidate at defensible positions and await contact. Do not attempt travel to military installations. Perimeter is restricted. Don't come to us. Stay where you are. We'll come to you, or they wouldn't. The message made no promises about timeline or method. It was a holding pattern broadcast designed to keep people stationary and hopeful, while the actual decisions were made by people in rooms we'd never see about priorities we'd never be consulted on. Garrett still wanted to respond. Every day he made the case, and every day we voted, and every day the vote was the same. Listen, don't transmit. The consensus held. But I could see it eroding in Nina's eyes. In Garrett's increasingly strained arguments, in the fundamental human need to believe that someone out there had a plan larger than ours. I didn't blame them. I just didn't share it. The decision came on day 16, and it didn't come from the radio or the infected or the reservoir level. It came from Tomas. He woke with a fever at 2 a.m. Marisol's hand was on his forehead before his eyes were fully open, the reflex of a mother who sleeps with one sense always pointed at her children. The fever was 102.4, taken with a thermometer from her veterinary kit. She checked his pupils, his throat, his lymph nodes, his skin for marks or bites or breaks. Nothing. No wound. No exposure she could identify. It's not the infection, she said. And the fact that she had to say it, had to stand in a room full of adults and clarify that her son's fever was mundane rather than apocalyptic, told me everything about the world we were living in now. Every cough was a death sentence, until proven otherwise. Every fever was the end of everything, until the thermometer said it wasn't. Tomas had an ear infection. Marisol diagnosed it with an otoscope she'd packed in her veterinary bag. She had antibiotics, amoxicillin, dosed for a 60-pound dog, which she recalculated for a 45-pound boy with the practiced confidence of someone who understood pharmacokinetics across species. She administered the first dose with apple juice from a can, and the calm demeanor of a mother who would not allow her fear to become her son's fear. But the fever held. Day 1, 102. Day 2, 103.1. The amoxicillin needed time to work, Marisol said. 48 hours minimum before clinical improvement. But 48 hours with a rising fever in a concrete building with no pediatrician, no hospital, and no emergency services was a different proposition than 48 hours in a world with ambulances. I found Garrett at the radio on the morning of day 17. He wasn't transmitting. He was sitting in front of the shortwave with his hand on the transmit key and his eyes closed. And when he heard me enter, He opened them and said, "His fever is 103.4. I know. If it hits 104, we need help we don't have. Marisol has it under control." Marisol is a veterinarian treating her own 7-year-old with dog antibiotics in an abandoned power station during a zombie apocalypse. That is not under control. That is the best we can do. And there's a gap between those two things that a child's life might fall through. He was right. The gap he described was real, and I'd been standing on my side of it pretending it wasn't there. Because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that my fortress, my beautiful, self-sufficient, engineered fortress, had a limitation I couldn't weld or wire around. Some problems require institutions. Medicine is one. Children are another. I looked at the radio. I looked at Garrett. I thought about Caleb, 1,400 miles away, and whether Deborah had taken my warning seriously, and whether my son was sick in a place without help, and whether someone somewhere was sitting in front of a radio, deciding whether to call for help for him. "Marisol makes the call," I said. "It's her son. It's her risk assessment." We went to her. She was sitting beside Thomas, who was sleeping fitfully on a cot we'd assembled from maintenance bay tarps and aluminum framing. His face was flushed and his breathing was shallow, and his small hands were balled into fists against the sheets. "His temp is 103.4, she said before we spoke. "The amoxicillin should be working by now. If it doesn't drop by tonight, I need IV fluids I don't have, and a broad-spectrum antibiotic I don't have. Kirtland might have medical resources." She looked at me, at Garrett, at the radio visible through the control room door, at her son. "Transmit," she said. "Give them our location. Tell them we have a functioning hydroelectric station and a 7-year-old who needs a doctor. If they come, they come. If they take the station, they take it. I will not let him die to keep a building." I sat down at the radio. I picked up the microphone. I pressed the transmit key and said the words that opened the gate. I'd spent 16 days building to keep closed. "Sierra Lima 19er. This is Caballo Dam Hydroelectric Station. We are operational. We have 7 survivors. We need medical assistance. Over." The reply came in 4 seconds. They'd been listening the entire time. Tomas's fever broke 6 hours before the helicopter arrived. The amoxicillin had been working all along. Marisol was right about the timeline, right about the dosage, right about everything, the way she'd been right since the moment she pulled into my gate and told me what she had and what she needed in the same sentence. The helicopter brought 2 medics, a lieutenant who surveyed the station with the appraising eyes of a man cataloging assets, and confirmation that Kirtland was establishing a network of operational infrastructure points across the state. They didn't take the station. They logged it. They left medical supplies, a case of MREs, and a frequency for regular check-ins. The lieutenant called me essential civilian infrastructure, and I felt the phrase settle into the same category as the rest of my labels: electrician, combat engineer, divorced father, man who builds things alone. Except I wasn't alone. That was the part the label missed. I'd built a fortress for one, and it had become a station for 7 because the structure was never the point. The structure was just the excuse to be standing somewhere when the people arrived. I had 7 days to prepare. It took me 16 to understand what I'd been preparing for.